On a plateau overlooking the city of Cairo, there stand 3 huge pyramidal burial tombs, with an enormous statue of a half-man, half-lion creature standing guard next to them. These monuments, especially the tallest of the 3, the Great Pyramid of Giza, fascinate us today. They were already a subject of wonder for many writers in ancient times. As early as the 5th century BC, writers from around the eastern Mediterranean world were reflecting on them. Herodotus, the Greek father of history, in his Histories, an account of the Persian invasions of Greece in the early 5th century BC, attributed the construction of the Great Pyramid to a ruler named Cheops. This Egyptian ruler had allegedly forced 100,000 men into slaving away on building the great edifice over a period of 20 years. The foremost scholar of Egyptian heritage from the ancient world, a priest by the name of Manetho, in his Egyptica, written in the 3rd century BC, named the Egyptian king who built the Great Pyramid as Sufis. Both of these are renderings of the name Khufu, so there was some truth to their accounts. A century later, Antipater of Sidon was one of the first figures we know about to start writing about 7 wonders of the world, of which he claimed the Great Pyramid was the greatest of all. And on it went, with the Greco-Roman historians and geographers Diodorus Siculus and Strabo in the 1st century BC, and the Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder a century later, writing extensively on the Great Pyramid and its mysteries. Hence, even in ancient times, the pyramids at Giza and elsewhere in Egypt fascinated the people of the Mediterranean world. And yet, these were not the product of a mature civilization that had developed over many centuries. What is most striking about the pyramids is that they were built so early on in the development of ancient Egypt. They date all the way back to the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, more than 4,500 years ago. This is the story of the Old Kingdom, the first of the 3 supposed golden ages of ancient Egypt. The Old Kingdom was able to develop as it did because of its geographical location. Generally speaking, all of the main centers in which the earliest advanced human civilizations evolved lie in a specific region. This is a band of the Earth which lies between the 15th line of latitude north of the equator and the 45th line of latitude north. The climate here is optimal for agriculture. Crops can be grown in this region without advanced methods, while the area is also cool enough for extensive water sources to be available. It is no surprise that all of the world's earliest centers of urban development are found within these lines of latitude. Specifically, the cultures of Mesoamerica, the first major civilized regions of China, the Indus Valley civilization of India and Pakistan, the cities of Mesopotamia, and the culture of ancient Egypt. Egypt was doubly benefited by its location. It lies on the edge of the Fertile Crescent. This is a crescent-shaped band of fertile land, stretching from Egypt north into the Levant and towards Turkey, before curving down into Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. It is believed that when the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago, a rich layer of alluvial soil was deposited along the Fertile Crescent, allowing for the extensive development of agriculture here in Neolithic times. This favored the emergence of advanced cultures here as the Stone Age came to an end. Egypt did not just benefit from its latitudinal location and its place on the western side of the Fertile Crescent. It had one further exceptional advantage: the River Nile. This is the longest river on Earth, although it is far less complex an entity than the Amazon River or even the Congo River. It rises in two different locations, known as the Blue and White Nile Rivers in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa and in Ethiopia. These two rivers then converge in modern-day Khartoum in Sudan before flowing onwards into Egypt. The ancient Egyptians considered that their land was divided into two distinct areas. The southern region was called Upper Egypt. They referred to it as Upper Egypt even though it was more southerly, because of its more elevated topography. The Nile flows firmly and broadly through here, as though it is bolting north to the Mediterranean, with a few twists and turns along the way. Conversely, in Lower Egypt, the more northerly part of the country, the river moves downhill and fans out into the Nile Delta, with many strands exiting out into the Mediterranean Sea. Here, in Lower Egypt, the Nile Delta offered excellent conditions for agriculture. But on top of this, prior to the artificial intervention in the river's annual cycle via the construction of the Aswan Dam in the middle of the 20th century, the Nile flooded each year. This flood, crucial to the survival of ancient cultures, was an event known as the inundation. After the flood receded, a layer of alluvial soil would remain on the banks of the river where the water had been. This soil was optimum ground for farming. It meant that the Nile could support large numbers of people through agriculture in ancient times, despite the arid, desert conditions elsewhere in Egypt. This annual inundation of the Nile was vital to life here in ancient times and was at the center of much of the religious calendar that developed during the Old Kingdom era. This centered on praying to gods like Osiris, Hapi, and Khnum for a good inundation in order to sustain life for another year in Upper and Lower Egypt. The Old Kingdom was preceded in Egypt by an era known in Egyptology, the study of ancient Egypt, as the Pre-dynastic period. The exact point at which the Pre-dynastic period started is fairly arbitrary. People had been living and hunting along the course of the River Nile for hundreds of thousands of years. As the last ice age ended, as elsewhere around the Middle East and West Asia, they began to live in a more sophisticated manner. Agriculture was gradually adopted as people noticed that wild plants such as barley and wheat would grow each year where the seeds from the previous year's plants had blown months earlier. Agriculture developed as people in Egypt and elsewhere intervened in this process and collected the seed to manage where these plants would grow the next year. Thus, farming was born. It, along with the ability to make ever more refined tools from stone and then copper, along with the firing of pottery and the settlement of large villages and then towns, constituted the first threads of civilization. All of this was appearing along the banks of the River Nile and downstream in the delta by the 5th and 4th millennia BC, the period usually referred to as the Pre-dynastic period. By around 3500 BC, some 5,500 years ago, things were accelerating. Senet, the world's oldest board game, was developed around this time, a sign of growing complexity in this culture, while the people of the region were trading more extensively with parts of West Asia, such as the Levant and even Mesopotamia. Historians and archaeologists remain divided on whether or not contact between Egypt and Mesopotamia drove cultural development in both regions at this time. Hieroglyphics, for instance, were developed in Egypt very soon after cuneiform, another early pictographic writing system, first appeared in Mesopotamia. While the pre-dynastic period was critical for the emergence of advanced civilization in Egypt, the various peoples that lived from the River Nile Delta all the way south towards Nubia, the name the Egyptians would develop to describe Sudan in ancient times, were not yet united. This act of unification was only achieved around 3100 BC, though the date and the details of the man who achieved it are quasi-legendary. The individual who united Upper and Lower Egypt is believed to have been King Nama, sometimes referred to as Menes. He was the founder of the First Dynasty, though this was not the beginning yet of the Old Kingdom. The fragmentary evidence indicates he initially ruled Upper Egypt and then conquered Lower Egypt. The idea of ancient Egypt being two kingdoms, ruled by one monarch, would last for thousands of years. Egyptian rulers were consistently depicted wearing both a white crown, representing Upper Egypt, overlaid with a red crown of Lower Egypt. The striking Nama palette, an elegantly carved and exceptionally well-preserved siltstone palette from the time, shows a king on one side wearing just the white crown of Upper Egypt, and then with both crowns on the other side. Nama is consequently considered the first king of a unified ancient Egypt. It is something of a misnomer to refer to him, or any of the later rulers of the Old Kingdom, as pharaohs. This is a much later term, developed during the New Kingdom in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, though the title is regularly applied retroactively to all the rulers of ancient Egypt. Nama's actions in uniting Upper and Lower Egypt ushered in the dynastic period of ancient Egyptian history. As we'll see very shortly, the Old Kingdom is typically identified as only beginning with the inception of the Third Dynasty. Thus, the 400-year period between Nama's time and the beginning of the Old Kingdom, during which the First and Second Dynasties ruled Egypt, is often referred to as the early dynastic period. The reason for the differentiation between the early dynastic period and the Old Kingdom is multifaceted. Firstly, the unified kingdom was growing very gradually in strength. In Nama's time, trade had been established between the Nile and the towns of the Mediterranean coastal region of the Levant. Some merchants even went back and forth, seemingly between Egypt and the Sumerian city-states of the river Tigris and the river Euphrates in Mesopotamia. But this trade became much more pronounced in the Old Kingdom period. The kingship and government was also weaker in the early dynastic period, while the development of a common culture focused on a pantheon of gods and goddesses, myths and rituals along the river Nile was only emerging in the time of the First and Second Dynasties. Perhaps most importantly of all, the kings of the First and Second Dynasties did not build pyramids as their mortuary tombs. They did, however, engage in erecting elaborate resting places for themselves in death. Yet these were less formidable than what came later. Their tombs were typically burial chambers encased in mud brick structures known as mastabas. The kind of massive monumental burial sites that characterized the Old Kingdom were not in evidence at all during the early dynastic period. The Old Kingdom began around 2700 BC with the inception of the Third Dynasty. It was the first dynasty in the history of ancient Egypt that featured rulers who built giant pyramids as their burial tombs. For this reason, when the mid-19th century German Egyptologist and diplomat Baron Christian Charles von Bunsen began developing a system of periodization to divide up the 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt, he identified the Third Dynasty as the start of one of the three golden ages of Egypt prior to the inception of Roman rule thousands of years later. Von Bunsen's reasons for identifying the Old Kingdom as a distinct golden age seem quite obvious at first. Simply put, this was the era in which the greatest of the ancient pyramids were built in Egypt. There were three main sites for these enormous structures: Saqqara, Dahshur, and the Giza Plateau. Today, the Giza Plateau with the Great Pyramid of Khufu and the nearly as grand pyramid of Khafre and the Sphinx is the most acclaimed of these, though the pyramids of Saqqara and Dahshur each have their own considerable significance. It would, though, be slightly too easy to identify the Old Kingdom as simply being about the pyramids. Von Bunsen's categorization of the three golden ages was about more than just the form of monumental building occurring at a given time. It also took into account the strength of the central government, the stability of the realm, and the sheer magnificence of the culture in Egypt at a given time. In this regard, the Old Kingdom was distinct from what had prefaced it in the early dynastic period. The government was stronger and capable of achieving more, both militarily and in terms of the sheer logistics of doing something like building huge pyramid tombs. Moreover, there was a distinct and grand capital emerging. This was Memphis, a city slightly south along the course of the River Nile from modern-day Cairo. It emerged as a major center of royal power in the Old Kingdom era, with tens of thousands of inhabitants. The Old Kingdom is generally considered to consist of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties, though, as we will see, Egyptologists debate whether a 7th dynasty should also be included in the chronology of the Old Kingdom. The sources available for studying the Old Kingdom are not as substantial as the later Middle and New Kingdoms. Similarly, there is far more evidence to be found regarding the Nubian dynasty and the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history. For study of the Old Kingdom, there are numerous valuable king lists extant, such as the Turin list, the Abydos list, and the work of Manetho. Then there is, of course, the archaeological history provided by the pyramids and the excavated sites around them. For instance, Egyptologists have been able to discover a huge amount about life in Old Kingdom Egypt by excavating the workers' villages around the building site on the Giza plateau, and so forth. A small number of papyri have survived from the time, though generally speaking, these have only come down to us in unusual circumstances, where they were placed in jars or were buried underground, conditions which have prevented the papyri from simply disintegrating over time. In many cases, we have papyri from later eras, like the New Kingdom, which shed light on the history of the Old Kingdom. There are also additional bits of material culture, like statues and funerary goods, that have survived, while there are copious amounts of pottery, bits of stone bearing hieroglyphics, and other goods. Inevitably, though, given that it all took place in or around 4,500 years ago, the history of the Old Kingdom has to be reconstructed in a highly fragmentary manner. The first ruler of the 3rd dynasty is generally identified as a king named Djoser. Djoser himself is a controversial figure in that the king lists always throw up contradictions. Consequently, arguments could and have been made that he was not the founder of the 3rd dynasty. Most Egyptologists place his reign as beginning around 2686 BC and lasting for roughly 20 to 30 years. He was probably the most substantial and powerful ruler of the 3rd dynasty, which lasted for most of the 27th century BC. Above all, he is known for building the first major pyramid of the Old Kingdom. This is known today as the Pyramid of Djoser, although in older books it used to primarily be referred to as Step Pyramid Saqqara. This is because it was built at a site called Saqqara, a large necropolis full of temples and mortuary tombs, on a plain northwest of the Old Kingdom capital, Memphis. It is called the Step Pyramid because it was built in 6 large step-like layers. Djoser's tomb stands over 200 feet high and involved the use of over 11.5 cubic feet of stone. It is understood that Djoser and the possible architect of the Step Pyramid, his vizier, or the leader of his government, Imhotep, had originally planned to build a mastaba. This was a much more modest, raised tomb that would have been in line with earlier mortuary tombs for Egyptian kings. However, it is clear that the design changed, and Djoser's followers erected a pyramid. The result was the first great pyramid of both the Old Kingdom and ancient Egypt, one which is still substantially intact today, around 4,700 years later. What was more, Djoser's pyramid was just the centerpiece of an enormous mortuary complex of temples, courtyards, statues, and smaller tombs. This made it a template for monumental building in ancient Egypt thereafter. The Third Dynasty prevailed for most of the rest of the 27th century BC, that is, down to around 2610 BC. In theory, this should be a relatively easy dynasty for the king lists to have provided information for. There were only a handful of rulers with lengthy reigns, over a period of around 75 to 80 years. And yet, the weaknesses of our sources for the Old Kingdom become all too clear when trying to evaluate the Third Dynasty. The sources are rarely in agreement. There is a general consensus that there were 4 kings after Djoser in the dynasty. However, their names, the duration of their reigns, and years of them differ considerably across Manetho's work, the Abydos, Turin, and Saqqara king lists. For instance, Djoser was almost certainly succeeded by his son, a king typically referred to as Sekhemkhet, but the king lists provide different names for him. Manetho named him as Tyres, a Hellenized version of the name provided for him in the Abydos king list, Teti. Thus, there is often a lack of precision when it comes to the Old Kingdom rulers. The general outline of things is apparent, though. After Sekhemkhet came Sanakht, then Khaba, and finally Huni. None of these rulers was apparently as significant as Djoser, though Khaba is understood to have been the king who ordered the construction of what is called the Layer Pyramid at Zawiyat al-Aryan, near Giza. This has collapsed over time, although there are still substantial remains of it visible today. This, and a so-called buried pyramid, which Sekhemkhet is believed to have ordered to be built, but was never completed, both contain a peculiar feature. This is that both pyramids were half set into the ground, with tunnels below the surface level that were intended to be the burial chambers of the kings they were built for. There were also many temples and mastabas built for nobles and other high-ranking individuals in the wider complex surrounding the Layer Pyramid. The culture that was developing in the wider Old Kingdom was not exclusively to do with pyramids and mortuary tombs. That being said, the denizens of the region in and around Memphis must have been conscious of the vast amount of resources, labor, and energy that was being expended on building these huge new tombs, temples, and monuments. On the other hand, this was not too unusual if we consider the lengths which other Neolithic peoples were willing to go to around the world. The people of southern England, for example, would construct Stonehenge. Similarly, in Ireland, we find the New Grange Passage tomb, a site that is half a millennium older than even the pyramids. Tens of thousands of people must have been employed at different times in quarrying stone and manufacturing bricks for these projects in Old Kingdom Egypt, while even more would have been involved in subsidiary roles. Beyond this, the vast majority of ordinary people, as in all pre-modern societies, were involved in food production. People lived in simple mud brick houses in villages and small settlements along the banks of the River Nile, growing wheat, barley, and vegetables, on the soil that had been fertilized by the inundation of the river. Many people engaged in small industries. The Egyptians were great potters, and the production of pottery in all early societies was incredibly important. It was needed for everything from transporting water to the consumption of food. It was also vital for trading wine, olive oil, and other goods over large distances. Another section of society manufactured papyrus from reeds gathered from the banks of the Nile. Here, skilled artisans that crafted statues and painted walls were also emerging. It was a simple society in its own way, yet much more complex than most that had preceded it. The religious system of ancient Egypt was largely in existence in its mature form by the time of the Old Kingdom. Contrary to how it is regularly depicted, the Egyptian system was not obsessed with death. It was obsessed with life. Indeed, so obsessed were the Egyptians with life that they developed a sophisticated cosmology and mythology around it. These were focused on the idea of preserving a person's existence beyond the confines of their natural life. The Egyptians believed that humans contained an essential life force, or ka, what we would now term a soul, following later Greek commentary on this concept. The ka was nurtured in life with food, water, and other types of sustenance, and they believed it could be continued in death in various ways. One of these was through preservation of the bodily vessel, and so the ancient Egyptians practiced mummification to preserve the remains of the dead. This was not just applied to the corpses of dead kings and queens. There are many examples of upper-class Egyptians being mummified, and even animals. On top of this fascination with the preservation of life in death, there was a complex pantheon of over 1,500 gods and goddesses. Like any polytheistic religion of the ancient Mediterranean and West Asia, there was a hierarchy, and some of these gods were much more important than others. During the Old Kingdom, the sun god Ra was the most revered of all the gods. He was said to travel through the sky in a solar arc, bringing light to the world in the daytime. When he retired in the evenings, night fell on the world. Osiris was the king of the underworld and was another major deity of the time. Overall, the ancient Egyptian religious system was a central pillar of their civilization. It was also enormously influential in the formation of later polytheistic religions of the Mediterranean, such as those of the Greeks and the Romans. The Third Dynasty came to an end around 2610 BC. A fair number of Egyptologists agree that the most likely date of the commencement of the Fourth Dynasty that followed it was 2613 BC, with the accession of King Sneferu. Sneferu is not a household name today, not in the same way that later Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom like Ramesses II or Tutankhamun are. Similarly familiar are Khufu and Khafre, the men for whom the two large pyramids on the Giza plateau were built. Nonetheless, Sneferu was every bit as consequential a ruler of ancient Egypt as these later kings. Without him, there might have been no Great Pyramid at Giza, for reasons which will become clear in just a minute. Historians disagree as to the length of his reign. He ruled for at least 20 years. It could have been substantially longer, perhaps upwards of 30 or 40 years. Most likely, his reign lasted in or around a quarter of a century. He was succeeded by Khufu, who was almost certainly his son, and who will also feature very prominently in the subsequent story of the Old Kingdom. After Khufu, two of his sons reigned. First, Djedefre, for a small number of years, and then Khafre, for a much longer period of time. The other strong rulers of the Fourth Dynasty were Menkaure, the son of Khafre and grandson of Khufu, who himself ruled for around 30 years, down to nearly 2500 BC. This preceded the 5-year reign of Shepseskaf, a king who was almost certainly the last monarch of the 4th dynasty. That said, there are some erroneous names on the king lists which Egyptologists speculate might have either been very short-lived rulers, co-rulers of some kind, or even entirely fictitious. Sneferu was arguably the most important of all the pyramid-building rulers of the Old Kingdom. Over his lengthy reign, he is understood to have built no fewer than 3 enormous pyramids. What is more, the manner in which these projects were undertaken led to a revolution in pyramid construction that allowed for the subsequent erection of the Great Pyramid of Giza by Khufu. The earliest of the pyramids attributed to the reign of Sneferu is the Meidum Pyramid. It was a straight-sided pyramid erected south of modern-day Cairo. It was built in 3 layers, with steep sides, and was a kind of evolution of the step pyramid method that Djoser had employed nearly a century earlier. Much of it had begun to collapse in ancient times. However, the core of it remains in place to this day, and appears like an imposing fortress with slanted walls rather than a pyramid. We can only speculate about why Sneferu decided to undertake the construction of a second pyramid, and when. Perhaps he was dissatisfied with the Meidum Pyramid, and was already planning a new pyramid before the first was completed. The second edifice he ordered the construction of is known today as the Bent Pyramid. It was erected at Dahshur, a necropolis site that would become a center of mortuary tombs and pyramids for centuries to come. The Bent Pyramid, as the name suggests, was built at an angle and turns quite suddenly halfway up the sides. It is semi-unique in that approximately 4,600 years later, large parts of the Tura limestone casing it are still in place on the outside of the pyramid. Finally, Sneferu was also responsible for building the Red Pyramid, the name of which derives from the red limestone used to build the bulk of it. It is a pyramid with a more straightforward shape. What is highly important is how big it is. It is around 5 times the size of the Pyramid of Djoser, in terms of the sheer volume of stone quarried and used to build it. Sneferu's building program led to a gradual evolution in the technical knowledge needed to build the most famous pyramids of the Giza Plateau. In the course of his reign, the scale and size of the pyramids had developed through experimentation. By the time the Red Pyramid was built, Sneferu's engineers likely concluded that the best way to build these monuments was the way that seems to us today the most practical. That is, that a pyramid shouldn't be built in steps or with bent angles. It should simply be erected as a true pyramid with evenly ascending layers. If the stone was heavy and assembled correctly, such a pyramid would stand the test of time. That certainly proved to be the case with the Red Pyramid. Indeed, were it not for his successors, the Red Pyramid would probably be regarded as an immense wonder of the world today, as it is in a similar state of preservation and is over 2/3 of the size of the Great Pyramid at Giza in all particulars. It was not to be, though. Using the methods that had been developed through his father's intense pyramid-building program, Khufu ordered the construction of an even greater pyramid on what is now the Giza Plateau. At the time, this formed part of the region probably fed by a small branch of the Nile. This was a factor which aided in the transport of the over 2 million stone blocks used to assemble the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. To say that there has been a lot of commentary over the years about how the Great Pyramid was built would be an understatement. As we have seen, As early as the 5th century BC, writers like Herodotus was commenting on it in his histories. He argued that the king who had ordered its construction was fabled to have been an immense tyrant who forced his people to toil in building his unimaginably large tomb. Others marveled at how the Great Pyramid and neighboring monuments at Giza had been left behind there, with so little indication of how they had been built. Egyptologists and archaeologists have uncovered how this was so in modern times. There are extensive remains under the sand of what is typically termed the workers' village at Giza, although by the standards of the 26th century BC, it was actually a sizable town, or even city in and of itself, housing thousands of workers and associated staff. The site was laid out over more than 24 acres of land and had sprawling fields and buildings around to supply the workers with food and store goods. In addition to this, stone was quarried in vast quantities in Lower Egypt for the project. 8,000 tons of finer granite were quarried as far away as Aswan in southern Egypt and transported hundreds of kilometers north. Water transport made all of this possible. Beyond the River Nile, it is even speculated that water was used extensively to speed up the quarrying and transport of the stone at all stages of the process. The result was an enormous monument of 216 layers of stone, cut, transported, and arranged by a workforce which probably stretched into the tens of thousands. Nor is it merely a gigantic pile of stone. Elaborate passages and chambers were inside, including a room that acted as the burial place of King Khufu, while small shafts led from these rooms to the exterior of the pyramid, most likely to point at certain constellations in the night sky. Egyptologists continued to disagree on the precise purpose of these shafts. The whole pyramid was covered in fine limestone, which is no longer present today. This gave the monument a polished finish in ancient times. At the very top, a pyramidion, carved from fine stone, would once have topped the whole edifice. Sadly, it is lost today. The Great Pyramid of Khufu had stood at just over 480 feet high when the capstone or pyramidion is taken into account. It is around 455 feet without the pyramidion, a size that made it the tallest man-made object in the world for thousands of years to come. It was almost immediately eclipsed, though. Khufu's near successor, his son Khafre, who came to the throne after the brief reign of another of Khufu's sons, Djedefre, decided to build a very similar pyramid on the Giza plateau, directly next to his father's final resting place. Khafre's pyramid was about 470 feet high, with the pyramidion taken into account, and nearly 450 feet without the capstone. As such, its parameters are only fractionally smaller than Khufu's pyramid. Perhaps the son decided to order his architects and engineers to do this on purpose, out of deference. Or maybe he was playing a trick of the eye. Today, it can be hard to tell which is actually taller on the plateau. This is partly because some of the exterior limestone casing actually remains in place at the very top of Khafre's pyramid, a rarity amongst any of the ancient Egyptian pyramids. More importantly, Khafre had his pyramid built on higher ground. From a distance, although it is fractionally smaller than his father's immense tomb, an optical illusion occurs, which makes Khafre's pyramid appear taller, depending on where it is being viewed from. And then, of course, there is the fact that Khafre is widely believed to have also ordered the construction of the Sphinx. This was a 240 feet long and 66 feet high anthropomorphic statue which blends the body of a lion with the head of a human. Alternative theories propose that Khufu, or even Djedefre, ordered the construction of this enormous statue, which faces east to the rising sun, but on balance, most Egyptologists favor the idea that Khafre was responsible for its creation. There is no doubting that Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre were the greatest of the kings of the Fourth Dynasty, and more broadly, of the Old Kingdom, with Djoser added in from the Third Dynasty. Menkaure will always be remembered for having ordered the construction of the third pyramid on the Giza plateau. His pyramid is far smaller than those of his father and grandfather. Menkaure's pyramid is 65 meters, or 213 feet high, less than half the size of the other two kings' pyramids at Giza. An interesting feature of it is that Menkaure's pyramid is closely flanked by 3 additional pyramids that are much smaller again. These were upwards of 30 meters high when first built. They are considerably damaged today and appear to be even smaller. There are several theories about who these were built for, with one suggesting that they became the tombs of the 3 queens of Khafre, the ancient Egyptians having practiced polygamy. Exactly why Menkaure opted for a more scaled-back approach to his building projects at Giza is a matter of conjecture. Perhaps the sheer amount of resources expended by his grandfather and father in erecting their much grander pyramids had simply placed a major strain on the royal government. A question does arise as we survey the pyramids. Beyond their obsession with piling rocks on top of each other in vast pyramid shapes, how were things faring for the rulers of the Old Kingdom? The answer is pretty good. The same species of strong centralized kingship which allowed rulers like Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre to employ tens of thousands of people to quarry millions of large stones and transport them to Dahshur and Giza for their pyramids, also allowed for the recruiting of a powerful army. With it, the kings of the Fourth Dynasty were expanding the Old Kingdom beyond Upper and Lower Egypt. There is clear evidence of a southwards expansion up the River Nile into what we now know as Sudan. The Nile in this region is marked by cataracts, sections of the river where the waters narrow and become more shallow, and where they are characterized by whitewater rapids. The Fourth Dynasty rulers expanded south to the Second Cataract and established a colony at Buhan in what is now northern Sudan. This became an economically and strategically important center of copper mining, a vital metal in the burgeoning transition to the production of bronze, an alloy produced from copper and tin. Elsewhere, there was expansion into the Sinai Peninsula, which was a mining center too, as well as contact with Libya and the Levant. The Old Kingdom's control over these latter regions, however, was not as robust as would occur a millennium later in the time of the New Kingdom. The culture of the Old Kingdom will always be remembered for the pyramids. There were many additional aspects to it, parts of which have also survived over more than 4,500 years, albeit in a much more fragmentary fashion. Minor examples of this include items such as a miniature statuette of Khufu which was carved out of ivory. This survived quite intact, to be pulled out of the ground during excavations at Abydos at the start of the 20th century. A much more impressive example of royal statuary is Khafre enthroned, a life-size statue of Khufu's son, which was carved out of a block of anorthosite gneiss. This is a dark, blackish stone that is rare and valuable, not to mention extremely hard and difficult to carve. It was discovered in 1860 near the site at Giza and was originally carved to form part of Khafre's valley temple near his pyramid. The survival of excellent statues continued into the reign of Menkaure. The best collection of Old Kingdom statuary survives from his reign. Many of these were life-size statues carved from greywacke, a kind of dark and hard sandstone. The most famous of these features Menkaure, with the goddesses Hathor and Anput either side of him. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts is home today to a colossal statue of Menkaure, carved from alabaster. This is a much softer material that became extremely popular for making statues and all kinds of decorative objects in ancient Egypt. The Fourth Dynasty was the pinnacle of the Old Kingdom. It came to an end just after 2500 BC, according to the evidence of the king lists. It was then followed, fairly unsurprisingly, by the Fifth Dynasty, the first ruler of which was a king called Userkaf. Although he is generally said to have only reigned for a comparatively short time, around 7 years, there is a wealth of archaeological remains from the extensive building program he undertook. This included a sun temple in honor of Ra at Abu Sir near Memphis. Although badly damaged when it was excavated, this site and several more have revealed many well-preserved statues of this particular Old Kingdom ruler. He and his many successors in the Fifth Dynasty over the next century and a half continued the pattern of building pyramids as their mortuary tombs. However, they were nowhere near as successful as their predecessors in the Third and Fourth Dynasties. Sticking with the example of Userkaf, he had a pyramid built at Saqqara, very near to Djoser's step pyramid on the same pyramid field. The construction method was fundamentally different and designed to save time and effort. Userkaf avoided carving out large numbers of well-cut stones from a quarry and employing the enormous amount of labor required to carry them into place. Instead, his pyramid was built by using roughly cut blocks and piling them together. They were then encased in fine, polished limestone. The effect was that when the pyramid was built, it would have looked quite refined. But once the outer limestone was removed, the inner stone was much more prone to collapsing, which it did over time. Why this method was preferred for Userkaf's pyramid is unclear. It may simply have been that he became king when he was already quite old. The shortness of his reign, therefore, necessitated faster construction. Whatever the cause, it proved far less successful than the pyramids of the Third and Fourth Dynasties. In the reign of the second king of the Fifth Dynasty, Sahure, work began on a new pyramid complex at Abu Sir, where his father Userkaf had erected the Sun Temple in honor of Ra. Similar labor-saving and cost-cutting methods were employed here. In fact, they were more extreme. Walls of small rocks were used to build up the edifice, and large parts of it were then filled with substances like rock chips, sand, clay, and even broken bits of pottery. Then the whole thing was encased in finer limestone on the outside. The effect was the same as with Userkaf's pyramid. On initial viewing in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, it would have looked quite impressive, but it was nowhere near as durable as the earlier pyramids at Saqqara, Dahshur, and Giza, especially once the outer limestone casing was removed. All of this points towards the reduced power of the kings of the Fifth Dynasty. As the effectiveness of central government declined, they were unable to undertake projects on the vast scale of the Fourth Dynasty. This being said, while the pyramids themselves were less impressive during the Fifth Dynasty, the actual temple and religious complexes around them were grander than what had gone before. Kings like Sahure ensured there was an entire series of buildings around their pyramids, while the number of rooms and the range of decorative art within the pyramids were greater than at Giza. The temple of Sahure's pyramid has over 1,200 feet of running art along the walls. By way of contrast, there was just over 325 feet of running art on the walls of one of the temples next to Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. The pyramid complexes of the Fifth Dynasty rulers were therefore not inferior in all respects. Although the Fifth Dynasty clearly indicated a decline from the majesty of the Fourth Dynasty, it was nothing compared to what followed it in the Sixth Dynasty. This began around 2345 BC and lasted down to around 2180 BC. Again, the king lists do not always agree with one another, and the years for reigns and dynasties are approximations. Indeed, in many cases the king lists are simply incomplete, confusing matters further. This is the case with the first king of the Sixth Dynasty, believed to have been King Teti. Teti is named on the Turin king list, the most extensive of all the king lists from ancient times. However, the piece of the papyrus manuscript which provided the details of how long he ruled for has been destroyed. It is believed that he ruled for around 12 years, though Manetho suggests a reign of upwards of 30 years. Notably, his Horus name, a kind of alternate regnal name used by Old Kingdom kings, was Sehetep-Tawi. This transliterates to "he who pacifies the two lands," a cognomen used by several kings during the history of ancient Egypt. The inference here is that there was a degree of civil strife in Egypt as the Fifth Dynasty transitioned to the Sixth. Teti seemingly acted to remedy this conflict, but it was an ominous portent of the divisions that lay ahead. The number of kings in the Sixth Dynasty is disputed. The king lists suggest up to a dozen, but several of these were monarchs who only reigned for a comparatively small period of time. Instead, the dynasty is said to have been dominated by the lengthy reign of King Pepi II. Both the Turin king lists and the account of Manetho suggest that Pepi II lived for over 90 years. However, even allowing for the fact that Pepi may have come to the throne as a child and lived to be an elderly man, this seems implausible. The figure of 90 years may be a result of the length of reigns often being calculated according to the cattle count, a kind of agrarian taxation event that was very important in ancient Egyptian government and society. This was carried out once or twice a year and formed the basis for royal taxation in the kingdom. It is understood that if 2 cattle counts occurred in a year, this could have been counted as 2 years for which a king was listed as being ruler. Therefore, Pepi II's alleged 90-plus years on the throne might have been 60 to 70 years in reality, in which 90 or so cattle counts were carried out. The graver issue, beyond the length of his reign, was that his term as king saw a steady erosion of royal power and the rise of the nomarchs, the name for the powerful nobles and regional governors of the Old Kingdom. From the middle of the Fifth Dynasty onwards, the nomarchs had taken to living away from the capital at Memphis. They chose instead to dwell in their regional strongholds, and it was this which led to the decline of the Old Kingdom during the Sixth Dynasty. The shift away from Memphis and growing power of the nomarchs ultimately signaled the end of the Golden Age and the inception of a period of instability, division, and decline. Egyptologists today generally mark the Old Kingdom as ending with the death of the last ruler of the Sixth Dynasty, who several of the king lists state was a ruler called Necherkare Siptah. His reign was relatively short and lasted a few years, from around 2184 BC to 2181 BC. As ever, though, the dates need to be treated more as guidelines than firm statements of fact when it comes to the evidence for the Old Kingdom. What is unusual is that there has been a debate for a long time about the Seventh Dynasty. For a time, it was believed that this was actually the final dynasty of the Old Kingdom, but most scholars today doubt that the 7th dynasty ever existed at all. The surviving king lists are central to this. As we saw earlier on, there are several of these, such as the Turin king list and the lists found in the Egyptica by the 3rd century BC Egyptian scholar Manetho. The only explicit reference to the 7th dynasty is found in Manetho's work. The other king lists move straight from what Egyptologists consider the 6th dynasty to the 8th dynasty. Thus, all earlier appraisals of the 7th dynasty are based on Manetho. This is made even more problematic by the fact that the Egyptica does not actually survive intact today. Our evidence from it is obtained third or fourth hand, after being copied down through the works of pagan Greek and Christian scholars over many centuries. Manetho states that there were dozens of kings of the 7th dynasty and that they ruled in quick succession, though he does not name them. Some Egyptologists have argued that the 7th dynasty is actually conflated with the 8th dynasty. Others argue that Manetho introduced the concept as a literary device used to highlight that a period of crisis and a rapid turnover of rulers followed on from the 6th dynasty. On balance, most Egyptologists accept that the 7th dynasty probably did not exist in any real sense. Despite this, the dynasties have not been reordered, as this would require undoing the chronological sequencing of over 200 years of scholarship on ancient Egypt. Thus, in reality, the Old Kingdom ended around 2181 BC with the termination of the 6th dynasty, after which the 8th dynasty begins, skipping over the probably fictitious 7th dynasty. There is a good reason for the confusion about the 7th dynasty and why Manetho would have wanted to introduce a literary device which stressed the chaos and disorder of the end of the 6th dynasty. The era after the 6th dynasty, for well over a century, was characterized by disorder. It saw a collapse of royal authority in Egypt. This lack of stability is seen even in the number of dynasties. The Old Kingdom had lasted for slightly more than half a millennium and yet had only consisted of 4 dynasties, 4 direct lines of 4 families. This kind of continuity occurs when there is strong leadership, no civil wars, and generally good leadership and conditions within a kingdom. Though, admittedly, a run of poor biological fortune can cut a dynasty short too. By way of contrast, in the 130 or so years after the end of the 6th dynasty, even if we omit the spurious 7th dynasty, there were 4 dynasties that ruled Egypt. The 8th dynasty, for instance, ruled for only about 20 years and saw a quick succession of short-reigning kings. The 9th dynasty was possibly longer and consisted of numerous rulers. Of these, the tyrannical Ahtos was said to have been a terrible tyrant who supplanted the final ruler of the 8th dynasty. The dynasty Ahtos founded was in turn succeeded by the 10th and 11th dynasties. It might well be the case that the rapid succession of dynasties was not actually succession, but overlap. This theory holds that the 9th dynasty had usurped the 8th dynasty, and the 10th and 11th dynasties might well have represented rival rulers in a divided kingdom torn apart by civil war. This would certainly explain why there are so many kings listed for this period, literally dozens and dozens over a period of 130 years or so. It also accounts for the fact that different sites were established as rival capitals, with Heracleopolis Magna, a city upriver from Memphis, becoming the center of royal authority of the 9th dynasty. Thus, the overall impression of this poorly documented period is of a collapse of royal authority, civil war, the emergence of rival dynasties, and a rapid changeover of rulers. Inevitably, there was a sudden cessation in the construction of grand burial tombs like the pyramids. As a consequence, in the early 20th century, Egyptologists devised the idea that this constituted a first intermediate period. This was a period of nearly a century and a half that spelt the end of the power and might of the Old Kingdom. It was a time of instability before royal power was reconstituted, and the second of Baron von Bunsen's golden ages, the Middle Kingdom, began towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. The kings of the Middle Kingdom would soon begin to try to replicate the grandeur of the Old Kingdom. Several of the rulers of the 12th dynasty attempted to build enormous pyramids as their resting places in the afterlife. However, these were constructed primarily from bricks and clay encased in limestone and did not prove as durable as the Old Kingdom versions. Most have collapsed. Meanwhile, the rulers of the Third Golden Age of ancient Egypt, as identified in the 19th century by Baron von Bunsen, the New Kingdom, were more concerned with building grand temples adorned with huge obelisks and colossal statues. For the rulers of both the Middle and New Kingdoms, the achievements and culture of the Old Kingdom acted as inspirations. The Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt is a remarkable period in not just that country's history, but in the evolution of human civilization. For thousands of years, society and culture had been developing gradually in the lands in and around the Fertile Crescent. Towns had emerged during the Neolithic period. Grand, monumental buildings were being built. Trade was developing. Still, things moved slowly. And then they began to move faster all of a sudden, at least in relative historical terms. Egypt went through a remarkable period in which hieroglyphics were devised. The two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were united, and a sophisticated culture emerged. This peaked during the Old Kingdom, a half a millennium which, despite the limited nature of our sources, appears to have justified Baron von Bunsen's categorization that it was a golden age. The Old Kingdom will always be remembered for one thing above all others: the pyramids. Of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid at Giza is the only one which remains standing today. This is all the more remarkable when we consider that the other 6 wonders were, on average, built about 2,000 years after the pyramids. This is a testament to the sheer back-breaking labor of tens of thousands of Egyptians nearly 5 millennia ago. It's also a result of the remarkable ascent of ancient Egyptian civilization during the era of the Old Kingdom, the first golden age of ancient Egypt. What do you think of the Old Kingdom? Was it a remarkable culture, or was its major achievement largely just restricted to building enormous pyramids, so many of which collapsed over time? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.